a major ruling in the indictment of former FBI Director James Comey, as a judge said earlier today that the Justice Department undermined the integrity of a grand jury proceeding. The Magistrate Judge William Fitzpatrick said the prosecution engaged in a, quote, disturbing pattern of profound investigative misstep. This from Fox News, talking about this most recent developed misconduct, saying the department needs to give the grand jury materials to the defendant. A judge ruled this on Monday, directing them to produce to defense lawyers all grand jury material. Comey's lawyers had sought the grand jury material out of concerns of irregularities that process may have tainted the case. Let's bring in right now former federal prosecutor, friend of the program, Neama Rahmani. Neama, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. The judge said, quote, there were fundamental misstatements of the law. What does he mean by this?
Andy, there's a lot to unpack here. So let me try to explain Judge Fitzgerald's ruling. So there's two broad categories of potential problems. The first is the evidence. The second is the grand jury proceedings. So I'll start with the evidence. What happened was in 2017, the FBI executed search warrants and they got emails and other evidence for someone named Daniel Richmond. Now, he's a Columbia law professor who happened to be a friend of James Comey, but also his lawyer. So when the FBI was originally investigating this leak to the Wall Street Journal, they were focused on Richmond. So they got this evidence from Richmond, and ultimately that case was closed. It didn't go anywhere. But as part of those search warrants, the evidence was supposed to be sealed or destroyed. So when the Department of Justice started investigating Comey, who allegedly provided this information to Richmond and then allegedly lied about it to Congress, the Senate Judiciary Committee, and Ted Cruz, they went back to this evidence. Now, there was a couple problems with that. First, they didn't get a new search warrant. Second, they potentially viewed privileged materials because Richmond was Comey's lawyer. So the judge said, well, hey, this evidence was supposed to be sealed and you didn't get a new search warrant and you were looking at potentially privileged communications between Comey and his lawyer. That's a problem. Normally what the DOJ is supposed to do is they're supposed to set up a taint team or a dirty team that's really walled off from the case. So if they've accidentally viewed something, the whole Department of Justice isn't disqualified. So that's one set of problems. So one of the agents who supposedly viewed some of this material went to testify before the grand jury. So that was a problem. But there was also some potential problems in Lindsey Halligan's presentation to the grand jury. So she, of course, was the new interim U.S. attorney who was appointed by the Trump administration to take over when career prosecutors resigned and didn't want to bring these charges against Comey. So there was some potentially problematic statements that Halligan made to the grand jury. Now, we don't know what they are because the publicly viewed version of the judge's order is redacted. But there is one thing that we can glean. There were two different indictments in this case. And originally, the grand jurors only returned a true bill or returned charges on 2 of the 3 counts. But when they went to the magistrate, they presented 2 versions of the indictment. One was incorrect. But here's the important point. There's a period of time between these indictments being returned to the court and prosecutors going back to getting the correct indictment where there's no grand jury transcript or recording. So the judge in the case took issue with that as well and said this is incomplete. So why does all this matter, Andy? Normally, if there's a defect in a grand jury indictment or a problem with a prosecutor that's important, you just go to the grand jury and you get a new indictment. The issue in this case, of course, is the statute of limitations will have run, that 5-year statute. That's why this is all critical in this case. The indictment is dismissed. It's going to be too late to go back and charge Comey.
Yeah, this is a whole mess in terms of what you just laid forth with those two-pronged, those missteps, as the judge stated in terms of this. The judge also said, quote, the court recognizes that the relief sought by the defense is rarely granted. How rare? Do we ever see this?
It's very rare, Andy. I could tell you during all my years as a federal prosecutor, I never had a case like this. First of all, you never have someone with no prosecution experience going into the grand jury. That's probably why we had some of these missteps. But even if you look at the time period, it took 2 hours for the grand jurors to return this indictment. And Obviously they didn't return it on all the counts. I could tell you in all the times, and I went to the grand jury many, many times, it took them maybe 5, 10 minutes max. So this is not your typical case. And normally, grand jury proceedings are secret. The defense, they can't get transcripts of the proceedings, but because of what happened here with those two indictments, the potentially privileged material, Halligan bringing two indictments to the courtroom well after 6 p.m. Really, it was a race against the clock. They were rushing. So this is not your typical case. And the judge acknowledged that. That's why this relief would really be extraordinary. That's why the government is trying to do everything they can to stop it, because they realize that they have some vulnerabilities here. There's some protections, privilege, attorney-client privilege. There's a privilege against self-incrimination, the Fifth Amendment, that was apparently talked about during the grand jury, which usually you're not supposed to do. And of course, there's constitutional protections, including the statute of limitations. So there's a lot at stake here, which means the judge is going to take a look at this case very closely. And we're not even talking about the selective or vindictive prosecutions, or even the arguments that the defense has on the merits in this case, that this wasn't a false statement or wasn't material. We're talking about the defect in the procedural proceedings themselves, and it could derail this whole prosecution that many people have been wanting. Whether you're on the right or left, there's a lot of people that don't like Comey, but this is a potentially big problem in the case, Andy.
And we've seen lots of motions by Comey's defense team. And I want to ask, because it feels like this is obviously coming out with this saying missteps, and there was an undermining of an integrity with the grand jury proceedings. Is this a precursor to a potential dismissal?
It is. And the best defense is always a good offense. And I think here, the defense does have the prosecution on the run a bit. Now, obviously, look, we're just talking about a magistrate judge. That is a lower level judge. They don't have the authority to dismiss a case. They just make recommendations to a district judge. That judge, of course, can dismiss a case. And of course, the government would appeal if there were a dismissal. It would go up to the circuit court, which would be the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. That's the intermediate level appellate court. Then, of course, a case like this with important legal and political consequences may end up all the way before the U.S. Supreme Court. So there's a lot at stake. This is just that first step with that magistrate judge. Certainly not the end of the road yet, but really the process is moving for a potential dismissal, which we never, ever see at the grand jury level. I mean, really, these are just sort of rubber stamps to get the indictment, get the charges, and move forward with the case. So the fact that the defense is already able to attack a vulnerability here, it's certainly a bad sign for the prosecution, because normally this is not something they ever have to deal with.
We'll see how much longer this indictment may be on the books. Neama, my last question before I let you go, because we talk about the special appointment of Lindsey Halligan, a person that really hasn't ever prosecuted a case, also the timetable for those statute of limitations, talking about the integrity of this. What's next for Lindsey Halligan if they say that she did this vindictively, as the defense is saying? What's the future for her?
Well, it's certainly going to be a terrible look for her politically, right? She'll have, egg on her face if she really botched this indictment. Let's not forget, I mean, she has experience, but it's primarily insurance experience, right? She's never prosecuted a single case. And for your first case to be a high-profile case like this that is likely going to be challenged at every step of the way, Comey had a very defiant tone. He came out on social media. Obviously, he's a lawyer himself, not just the former director of the FBI. So he's going to fight this case and push it to trial. So if Halligan were to lose this case on an important procedural technicality, I mean, that's a big problem. Now, it wouldn't necessarily affect the Letitia James case. Obviously, everyone's talking about that, because if there's a problem, her appointment, or if there's a problem with the grand jury indictment, in that case, they still have time to go back and get a correct indictment. But by waiting so long in this case, it's a potential problem for the DOJ. If they wanted to go after Comey, they really should have during the first Trump administration for the original leak. They're really trying to backdoor this case because they know the statute is run on the leak. They're trying to backdoor this case by charging him for making a false statement about the leak that the statute has already run, and they did it at the 11th hour. So that's why they're running into these problems. If they did so in a timely manner, they wouldn't be in this situation. So this case is very different from the Letitia James case, in my opinion.
All right, Neama, very interesting and obviously good detail on the developments of this, the judge making this ruling today. I appreciate your time, your reporting, your understanding here on Live Now from Fox. Thanks again.
Thanks, Andy. Talk soon.